Father James Hanvey asked me not to read out all his biography and to ad-lib so as to be brief. Now, we're good friends, so I said I would tell you all his defects first, but no, I won't. So just to honour what he asked for to be brief, but at least a couple of titles. He is an advisor to our Father General in Rome, as the Jesuit Father General. His title is the Secretary for the Service of Faith, advising the General of the Society of Jesus. Until this appointment, he was Master of Campion Hall and member of the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies of the University of Oxford. So just to say, a very good friend. I have witnessed him as he was seriously engaged in the early years of the synodal process. So his talk now is the Synod and Ignatian Spirituality, and you can take it from me, he knows whereof he speaks. So, James.
Thank you very much, Gerard. Of course, if you were to list all my defects, it wouldn't be brief. And I've been very impressed with the way in which people have been listening. So you've been listening very hard, so if you want to go to sleep at this point, feel absolutely free. That's a good discernment to make. However, the other exercise in listening is there are several ways in which we listen. I'm going to invite you to listen to this talk by making the connections, because you've been listening for 2 days now, and you'll find that a lot of the themes that should in some way come together here, and you will be able to make the connections better than I can. So that's another way of what I would call a participative listening that we've been really doing together. So what I want to do in this sort of final session is to say, okay, there's a danger here of overstating the Jesuit relevance for synodality. I do think, and I hope to show that, in fact, it has got great relevance. Matthew was bringing that out. I mean, I think one of the key ideas that Francis has introduced, two key ideas that Francis has introduced into this sort of ecclesial thinking. One is to really bring out discernment as not just an individual activity, as we were saying with the question, but actually as the church is a discerning body. Now, we're still in the process of discovering what that means. The other key thing that Francis, I think, has introduced is process. In an address that he gave to the Jesuits at the last General Congregation, he said, Jesuits don't inhabit spaces, they produce processes. I think it's very insightful for what he has been doing in his papacy. It's only in reflection, I think, many years from now, we'll look back and we'll see all the different processes that he has initiated. Now, if you're going to initiate a process, you also have to be able to be open to where the Spirit is leading, and also open to change and adaptation. So these are the different things that are here. Now, they're all Jesuit. They're not just Jesuit, but they're very much part of the Jesuit charism. So the society has something to bring, but it's not the only thing. Because in the work that I was doing in the early part of the Synod, we were working with a number of different charisms, both lay charisms from the San Egidio community, as well as all the other wonderful charisms with which the Spirit has gifted the Church, like the Dominicans, like the Augustinians, like the Benedictines. All of these great traditions, they all have something to contribute to spirituality and to synodality. And at one point, and I would still want to argue this, when we did a lot of work on the different ways in which the spiritual traditions discerned, at one point I thought maybe the Benedictine model for discernment has more to offer synodality than the Jesuit model. But we're open to that. So we're not alone in this, and we need all the charisms. The other thing is that it's not a Jesuit event, it's an ecclesial event. It's an ecclesial process. But I want to argue that, in fact, as we have been reflecting over these days, that the Ignatian spirituality is an important resource for the synodal process. The other key element that I think Francis has introduced and opened up is that the synodal process, it wants to make all the people of God active participants. And it's we almost take that for granted now, but in fact, it's quite a significant shift. And I hope as we run through this that I'll be able to illustrate why. So, what we draw from the Ignatian spirituality is some of the things that we've been touching on over these days. It's the method of listening, learning, and discerning. Anyone making the exercises is engaged in those three activities. And now they become ecclesial activities. We're beginning to articulate them for the church has always been these three things. Now we're going to see how our spirituality helps the church do that in depth. But I want to suggest that Jesuit spirituality effectively brings a spiritual theological praxis that is needed to sustain synodality. I was co-chair with Natalie Beckhardt of one of the commissions, the Commission on Spirituality. And it was a wonderful commission to work with, very interesting. But one of the problems, at least I encountered in what we were trying to do, yes, you'll see in all the synodal documents, it talks about the need for a spirituality. Surprise, surprise, the theologians weren't interested in that. The theologians were only interested in their theology and in the issues around their theology. Methodology wasn't interested in it very much either because they had all of their methodological considerations. So one of the interesting challenges is to find a spirituality which grounds synodality. And that in itself is quite a new thing. When before have we talked about a spirituality for the whole church? We haven't talked about that before. So again, we're still searching for that and we're still trying to bring it together. So these are some of the elements where I think Ignatian spirituality will help. St. Francis, right from the very beginning, Pope Francis, right from the very beginning, says that the synodality is a constituent of the church. And he repeated that in Episcopalis Communio. So twice this happens, and it's very important, he underlines it. Episcopalis Communio is the constitution for the synodal office and the working of the synod. And to say that is actually a novum, a new idea that is brought in. Of course, in one way, it's a double novum, I'm saying. It's a double new thing that he's brought in. Of course, it's already part of the normal practice of the Church since Vatican II, but it's a consultative operation. The synod, the regular meetings of the synod every couple of years to advise the Pope or to consult with the Pope, that begins to change. It's been part of the normal practice, but what's new and perhaps very challenging is, first of all, Francis's insistence that it must involve the whole people of God, not just for consultation. So no longer just the bishops, but the bishops with the people. And it's an extension to the laity to become active participants, not just consultative. Now, we haven't quite yet worked out all of that, how that happens in practice, but it's there, and it's part of how Francis is changing and deepening what we understood about synodality before. And then his other sense of synodality worked out in the interaction of three critical realities: communion, participation, and mission. But communion and participation to serve mission. Because the church only exists in mission. And that's fundamental for our understanding of the church. If the church isn't committed to mission in all its dimensions, then we simply become another organization. And of course, the other dimension of that is that means the church as an institution, as a community, doesn't have to worry about its own survival. Its survival is God's work. That leaves us enormously free. So we're not like any other organization. We have to change the product to make a bigger profit and to have more consumers. It doesn't work like that. The church needs to get out of that mentality. You don't measure mission purely by the extent to which your services are wanted. It's not a company. So in that sense, the church exists in an absolute freedom. It relies daily on the miracle of God's grace, on the constant Pentecostal outpouring of the Holy Spirit. Now, to build that into an organizational, institutional model takes quite a big transformation. That's why the other dimension of this novum must be conversion, and conversion in a deep sense, an ecclesial conversion as well as an individual conversion. But communion and participation serve mission, and mission is lived in communion and participation. That's the way those three are to work together. They certainly surfaced over the two assemblies, but in fact we're still working out the underlying theology of that, and also the underlying spirituality of that. How do those three elements come together? How do they deepen one another? You can see the problem already emerging, and it came up a little bit with Travis's question. You see it in the preparation. So the synod running from really 21 through to 24. If you look at the materials that were produced, quite an extraordinary amount of materials. There's consultation right out to the peripheries. That's another extraordinary innovation. And I remember when we had the report back from the Australian synodal group, how they had gone to great lengths to take the materials and to translate them and to put them into different, so that they could reach different levels of peoples, right out to the Aboriginal people. So there's extraordinary outreach that synodality has produced to let the peripheries, this is a great Francis thing, to let the peripheries come in. But that also then means that you get, I think there's a qualitative difference between the two documents that the two assemblies produced. I think the first assembly, it was an honest document. It recognized that there were points of agreement, convergences, but there were also topics that needed to be developed. There were other voices that needed to be heard. And then this is where we go to Travis's question. Those voices didn't appear. They were given out for the reasons I think that I had mentioned when I answered, but they didn't appear. So the second synthesis has a different quality from the first. And that must surely be part of what we're engaged with in the synthesis, saying, well, why are these two documents different? And what voices were excluded and what voices were included? And if we want to be genuinely open about the synodal process, if we're genuinely listening and transparent, we have to understand why that was the case. Because if the synod is about suppressing or erasing voices because we don't like what they're saying or we don't know how to deal with it, then there's a problem with the synodal process. My own personal view is one of the great things that happened in the second assembly was, I think, for the first time, the church actually had to face the complexity of its own Catholicity. Because there you have the whole church assembled, bishops, cardinals, lay people, lay representatives, and suddenly we discover that the Asian Catholic Church sees the world, lives its faith in a different context, in a different way, with different values from the American Church or from the Latin American Church. Now, this is real Catholicism in motion, in that sense. But it's not always easy, because what's important for us in Europe may not be top of the agenda for Africa, may not be top of the agenda for Asia. And what's top of the agenda here may not register at all for Europe. So how does this church live in depth its Catholicity, listen without feeling threatened by its own plural Catholicity? and not as a risk of schism or fracture, but actually as a genuine listening to what the Spirit is moving in all the different elements of it. That's a huge demand, which we've never had to do before in that way. So already we're in this new process and we're learning. And I want to emphasize the word process because it is a learning process. We had earlier on this question of ecclesiogenesis. The church develops, it grows. This is the ecclesiogenesis. This is the painful and the confusing ecclesiogenesis. The key way in which we think of the church, and maybe we've forgotten about it, is that it is a pilgrim church. It's pilgrim not just because it's living in history and moving towards its ultimate finality in the kingdom, in the realization of the kingdom. It's a pilgrim church because it has to go through all of these processes to be faithful to its mission. It's a journey, and we shouldn't be afraid of that journey. And Vatican II is still unfolding. One of the extraordinary features of Vatican II is it doesn't have an end. Its documents are open. It promotes a deeper reflection and appropriation. And I think that's also part of the synodal process. Just very quickly, we also talked in this a little bit, came up in one of the questions. We're coming out of an ultramontanist church. The ultramontanist church was created in the 19th century. I think in many ways it was a wonderful success because it held the church together when the rest of the world was falling apart. It gave a great sense of unity and of strength and of institutional, of ecclesial identity over against the world. Because the ultramontanist church was very much constructed as a society, an alternative society to the society around it. Within that, you get the ecclesia docens and the ecclesia decens, the church that teaches, the bishops, priests, and the church that is taught, the laity. But that dynamic, it offers a lot of security, but actually it's quite a static dynamic. Because how does the church that teaches, how does it learn? Where does it get its learning and to teach from? The church that is taught, is it purely passive? Is it just about obedience? So there's a transformation of what it actually means to be a member of the church in synodality, because those are all brought together. Now what we have is the laity can also, in their experience, in the life of their faith, they can also be teachers. And they have in history taught the church. And bishops, cardinals must be learners. They must learn to listen to the Spirit. So this is quite a change of culture. And it's a different, the synod thing is a different understanding of evangelizing, not against the world to go out and conquer the world, but one of the most beautiful passages in Lumen Gentium, if I'm not mistaken, it's paragraph 16, it talks that the church exists in all cultures to discern what is good in that culture and raise it up to God's glory. That's a different engagement with the culture. Not over against it, but living within it, bringing to birth the graces that God has already provided for that culture, whatever it is. So, that means that I think the challenges to current synodality, and this is where I think Ignatian spirituality becomes quite significant. The practice, there's a challenge to our practice. How do we work out a way of living and practicing this synodality, this process? And pay attention to the longings of the Spirit in the life of the people of God. How do we do that practically? How do we do that? We've begun. I think we can work at it still. We're still learning. Then I think the other side of that is we need an adequate theology for synodality, this version of synodality that we're living. My own personal view is that the theology we have at the moment is not adequate. It's a beginning, but it's not adequate. So again, the very fact that we're having this conference is part of our deeper reflection and developing that theology. And then the novum is synodality needs a spirituality. If you look at that first chapter, the first part of the second the final document of the Second Assembly, it says, yes, we need a spirituality and it should be linked to theology. It's very weak. So we're not there yet. So it's in this context then, I want to suggest to you that Ignatian spirituality has resources to offer the church. And we have touched on them already in some ways. Because spirituality is both a tacit knowledge, what we live with and we operate with. We don't need to reflect too much upon it. We live with it. And it comes through experience. We were talking this morning with Patrick about the habitus. One of the things, when we had, at the very beginning of this whole process, Natalie and I organized a conference on how do the different religious congregations discern? We all have methods of discernment, every religious congregation, and lay groups must have it too. So we brought them all together. And it was a very important, rich day. I learned a huge amount. But one of the things that I really did learn as I listened, the discerning comes out of the life of the community. It's what we were saying. Out of the habitus, we develop a way of doing it. That we don't necessarily reflect upon it, but we actually come to know how to do it because it's built into how we live together. It's part of the process. We need to develop this habitus. And if there isn't a habitus, all it remains is a protocol or a technique. And it ceases to be the expression of a life, because discernment is the expression of a life. And the other key thing that we are engaged in now, and is mentioned in the document, in the final report, is formation. Formation is critical. And I don't mean just formation of the wonderful you and me and the laity. Certainly the priests and certainly the bishops need to be formed too. And ask yourself, those of you who are training for priesthood, where on your programs at the moment have you had anything about synodality or the skills or resources that you need for synodality? Have you really had a program or a course on discernment or on what synodality might be? So formation becomes critical. And remember, formation is not just the theoretical side of it, which we need. Formation is also the living of it, developing the habitus. We learn by doing. So, where I want to go is, I'm going to skip this first part, which we've heard already, but just as a sort of mnemonic, because the two things I want to get to is, I want to say the two big things I think where Ignatian spirituality contributes is two critical things for synodality. One is the sensus fidelium. Well, I'll explain that in a moment. And the second is on discernment. We've heard Matthew on discernment, and we've been in that. I want to bring discernment. All of that's very valuable. We need to bring that in. But I just want to give it a particular sort of shape, which I think we're in danger of losing in all the talk of discernment. Okay, so very quickly. I want to introduce you to the term vernacular mysticism. Vernacular mysticism is it's used in the sort of spirituality to talk about those mystics that were not the professionals, the theologians or whatever. So very often in vernacular mysticism in the Middle Ages was the women. They weren't educated, they didn't go to the universities. They didn't, when they were talking about God and their experience of God, they weren't able to use Thomistic categories. But look at how Teresa of Avila writes about God with such a vividness. She is a real teacher of the church. Another great mystic is Julian of Norwich from England. Wonderful sense of God's motherly presence. These are the vernacular mystics. And what they also teach us, they also mediate the Spirit. I want to suggest to you that these spiritual exercises are a form of vernacular mysticism. Ignatius was not a theologian when he encountered and developed the exercises, the experience at Manresa. One of the problems was, when he wanted to use the exercises for the ordinary people, is that he wasn't trained, he wasn't a priest, he wasn't a professional. But the spiritual exercises are fundamentally a form of vernacular mysticism, which is their appeal for the whole people of God. Their openness. They're not Gnostic, and they're not only for the educated. So I want to suggest that the Ignatian spirituality offers us a vernacular mysticism for synodality, and that's what synodality needs. We've already seen that they're theocentric, and that's a corrective to ecclesiocentrism, which is the other danger. And the principle and foundation makes that absolutely clear, as does the formula of the Institute at the very beginning of the constitutions. We see that it's all ordered to mission, but first God. Everything is seen and understood in that theocentric direction. But it also opens out into a sense, a felt experience sense of the spiritual and the aesthetic, the whole economy of God's grace. How God works in all things. That's what I'm calling the economy of grace. And that's what discernment is attuning to. And part of the dynamic is we move from that individual, that pro-me, this is what you've done for me, God, into this is what you've done for us. Because we only know of God as the God pro nobis, as the God who has become one for us all. So already there's a universal horizon already in that movement, and that's part of the Ignatian vision, but it's also part of the gospel, obviously. And that means there's an intrinsic unity of God's salvific love, and which unfolds through the participation in the mission of Christ. So it's Christological, but also the renovating and the elevating action of the Holy Spirit. It's charismatic because it's ordered to mission and attentive to the gifts that the Spirit gives. But it's deeply pneumatological. We spoke a little bit earlier about the rules for thinking with the church. And one of the key things in those rules is that the church is guided by the Spirit. So the Spirit cannot be in conflict with itself. So we may have dissent, we may have disagreement, but ultimately we know, if that's the principle, that we have to listen deeper, we have to change, get rid of our own prejudices, to seek that unity of the Spirit, which doesn't blot out our individuality or our particularity. So all of that's the dynamic that's going on. And then, as we spoke about the Dea Riba, from the source, that all is directed from the Father through the Son. There's a natural order of mediation in the economy of grace. And that must be reflected in the way in which we discern and in the way in which we live. So it's ecclesial, yes, it's hierarchical, but it transforms what we mean by hierarchy. Hierarchy is simply not there to be power over, but power for. Hierarchy. And the other thing that's often missed is, and it comes through, I think, very strongly in the exercises once you reflect on it, is there is a prior hierarchy to the structure of the church. And the prior hierarchy is the hierarchy of holiness, which takes us beyond the institutionalization of charism. And I want to emphasize that dimension of holiness, which is critical for the exercises, right from the principle and foundation. Our journey is a journey into holiness and for holiness, because holiness is mission. Holiness is making Christ present in the world. And the synodal church must be committed to holiness, and the holiness of itself as church, but the holiness of its members. And that's why the communion of saints becomes significant. The communion of saints is not just, oh, they're all up there doing, nice things. The communion of saints is the living reality which we engage with, which is part of the church that we are in. Ignatius calls them the intercessors, and they're active in our mission. And that also brings in the eschatological dimension of holiness. And it's Ratzinger who brings this out in his book, that in fact, when he talks about the communion of saints, it is about the finality that awaits us, the glory that awaits us, the glory that awaits the whole of creation. So the saints and that contemplation and bringing them into the active life of the church has this eschatological dimension. And of course, Ignatius prioritizes the supernatural means. And you see that all the time in prayer and sacraments. He mentions it twice, at least twice, all the time, but it's the way in which he thinks that the supernatural always has priority. And that means that we are always building in to our way of thinking, our habitus, our way of knowing, it's an epistemological principle, is God first. We've dealt with God deals directly a lot. But look at the other actions of the exercises. They're dynamic, they invite us to be attentive and reflective, and their understanding is affective. They don't separate experience and affectivity from intellect. I will reflect and draw fruit. That's a whole methodology for synodality and its process. It's also the school of the Spirit, but also the service. I think one of the founding contemplations for the Society of Jesus is the Nativity. Because if you look at what happens in the Nativity, the grace I receive is I'm present before the child newly born, and I'm also meant to recall that this child is also going to be crucified. So we never step outside of the redemptive reality that we're engaged with, the cross. And what am I? I'm there as un pobrito, esclivito, indigno, unworthy, but I'm there to do something. So my heart, out of gratitude, is already engaged in an action of service. That, I think, is the mission of the Society of Jesus. And I think it's also a pedagogy for a synodal church. So the other thing that goes on in the exercises, second, third, fourth week, is an imitatio, but it's understanding God's way of acting. So I come to imitate, I come to represent, I come to practice God's way of dealing with the world. That requires a transformation of my imagination. There's a wonderful line from the very distinguished scripture scholar Luke Timothy Johnson, and in an essay talks about seeing the world as Scripture sees it. That's the transformation of the imagination, of the mind, that is brought about in the exercises. I'm being told to rush ahead here. 5 minutes? Sorry, yeah. So listening, attending, contemplating, interior and exterior. The importance of the director in all of that, I think, is a wonderful model of accompaniment for the whole synodal conversation and way of engagement. So the exercises at that level bring something to it. Very quickly then, the sensus fidelium is the key to synodality, as Francis understands it. Well, you see, it's Lumen Gentium 12. You can read this all later. But first of all, that emphasis on holiness. So what is the sensus fidelium? It's the holy people of God shares also in Christ's prophetic office. It spreads abroad a living witness to him, especially by means of a life of faith and charity. So experiential and action, by offering God a sacrifice of praise. That's the movement of the saints. That's what we're all called to do. That's the direction of the exercises. And it's when the entire body of the faithful, not just the hierarchy, but all of us, anointed as they are by the Holy One, we all receive the Spirit, cannot err in matters of belief. They manifest this special property by means of the whole people's supernatural discernment in matters of faith, when from the bishops down to the last of the lay faithful, they show a universal agreement in matters of faith and morals, aroused and sustained by the Spirit of truth. So what is that? It's a wonderful statement, but what it means is we all have an intuitive grasp of the truth of faith. It's aesthetic, it's affective, as well as intellectual. That's given to us. And it's going to be expressed in many different ways. I've been trained in theology, I can give it a theological expression. The person who is the living saint does it in the way in which he or she manages their family and their colleagues in work. These acts of charity. And you know when something's wrong and when something actually, no, this fits. There's an aesthetic dimension to all of this, which we shouldn't overlook. This is a definition, and it's central to Christian action. This conspiratio pastorum et fidelium, it's about how it's achieved. It's brought about by our attention to the Spirit at work in the whole body. So I'm arguing this also needs to be understood in the light of Lumen Gentium chapter 5, the universal call to holiness. That's often overlooked, but I think that's at the heart of Lumen Gentium when we're talking about its ecclesiology. And in fact, discernment, all of this, the actual opening into truth, the witness of the church means nothing if it's not about the living reality of holiness. And holiness is the normal state of the Christian life. It's not an extraordinary state, it's the normal state of the Christian life. And it's the evangelizing mission of the church is realized in her holiness. That's the principle and foundation. The key to it, I think, is this idea of a connaturality. Now, connaturality is when it's not. Let me give you an example. I'm sure we've all had to learn to ride a bike at some point, or learn to swim at some point. And certainly when I was learning to ride a bike, you fall off a lot of times. It requires a whole different set of skills that you have to learn physically as well as intellectually. It becomes second nature after a while. Connaturality is when the things of God become second nature. And my own capacity is enhanced. Things that I didn't think I could do before, I can now do because of God's grace at work in me. It sets up that attunement. That's the connaturality. And it's an intuition or an instinct for what is God's truth. And it's not just, as I said, it's not just objective knowledge, it's affective and aesthetic. It can be formally acquired, it can be taught, but it comes through the living experience. And just here at the end, this fides quaerens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. Anselm gives this definition, but he actually takes it up from Augustine. Augustine, at the opening of his work on the De Trinitate, uses Psalm 27. Of you my heart has spoken, seek his face forevermore. And what Augustine says, I believe in order to understand. So again, it's the prioritizing of the experience of faith, the living of it, and then the reflection. We tend to reverse it. We tend to give the theology first and then see how the practice. It's the reverse. That's how the Spirit works. How am I doing? Well over time, I should think. It's a truth which is lived. This is a wonderful quotation from Dignitatis Humanae. The truth cannot impose itself except by virtue of its own truth, and it makes its entrance into the mind at once quietly and with power. That's also the truth of faith. You can't be coerced into it. It works by attraction, and you invite it in. You know, it's like Zacchaeus invites Christ into his house. Martha and Mary invite Christ into their house. He doesn't come and bang down and knock down the door. That's how this truth works. It's also an extremely important principle for ideologies. It's contra all ideologies. And it's experiential. Fine, I'm going to end on this. And this is a key dimension is the cruciform nature of Christian life. So the sensus fidelium must have built into it the reality of the cross. Exercises, it's the third mode of humility, it's the third week. Christian life is has a cruciform life. That's also the Christian truth. And that means that into synodality, we must be attentive to the voices of suffering and abandonment in the sensus fidelium. Not just in the world, but in the sensus fidelium. and they must live in the experience and in the memory of the community. I don't think as a synodal church we've really realized that yet. We're still using political, sociological model. We must keep that voice out. That's embarrassing. We must attend to this deep suffering within the church. And I said, the synodal church must certainly be the inclusion of the marginalized, abandoned, and the peripheries. And we're required to live in affective solidarity and witness with those, internally as well as externally, and in the world. It's what I'm going to finish on this. It's called anamnetic alignment. You won't know what that means because I've just thought of it. What I'm speaking about here is the anamnesis of the Spirit. The Spirit brings things to memory, and not just brings them to memory, but makes them present. What I'm suggesting is, when we listen to the suffering in the community and in the world, and then we see within our own spirituality, this cruciform life, the third mode of humility, there is a remembering that the Spirit brings about, both within our spirituality and our theology and within our experience. And that's the anamnetic alignment. They come into alignment and we know this is the truth that we must follow. Okay. Right, I'm just the final confused. See, there's a lot here. You know it all already. Oh, discernment is dissent. We've dealt with that. So synodality is a work in progress. It's the action of the Holy Spirit. And just one thought from Sergei Bulgakov, a Russian Orthodox theologian, talks about the kenosis of the Spirit. And the kenosis of the Spirit is the way in which the Spirit deals with our limitations and works with our limitations. We also need to learn, when I was talking about the imitatio, we also need to learn from the Spirit how to work with our own limitations. That's the other dimension of kenosis. Not just going out to the other, wonderful, but also learning to live with the limitations of the other. That's the deeper level of kenosis of the Spirit. And I hope I've indicated anyway how the exercises can be a resource for developing this spirituality. And there's an Augustinian dimension given Leo the 14th. At the end of this conference on discernment, the Augustinian general was talking about how the Augustinians discern. And he summed it all up in that we become the sacramentum caritatis, the sacrament of love. And I'm adding for the life of the world. I'm saying that's the same as the contemplatio. Contemplatio is the sacramentum caritatis. And if you're interested in following up, also look at Benedict XVI's exhortation, the post-synodal exhortation on the Eucharist, which is called Sacramentum Caritatis. It's a very beautiful, powerful document, which again is at the heart of the Synodal Church. And it is a journey in hope. This is the year of hope, and it's from Romans 5. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit has been given to us. We are on this journey of hope, and it's a synodal journey, and there we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. If you want to come over, if we move straight into our round table, and we invite our speakers of the day to come up. We don't have a lot of time. We have 15 minutes. James, you're first. Thank you very much. Okay, that's great. So we can use a full 30 minutes. That's great. We have permission to keep going. So as we just assemble, thank you to James. Very rich in content. Very briefly, there is more work to be done in the Synod. Already during the Synod, there was a certain discordance between the theologians, the people of spirituality. So part of the work to do in the future is to improve that kind of collaboration of spirituality, theology into the synodal process. we remember that the synod is going on now in new iterations in our new papacy. And then, therefore, the rest of the talk in many ways were the continuing relevance of the spiritual exercises for what will go forward, what can go forward in the synodal process. So very rich reflections there. And the qualification that we're only one spirituality within the church, but nevertheless, in a conference like this, Jesuit speaking, a sense of the unexhausted resource that the spiritual exercises represent for the future of the Catholic Church, for the synodal process. So let's take just a moment. I invite you to have a good look at each of these speakers and to remember what they said. We'll take a little moment of silence, and this is even the end of the whole conference. So if you have thoughts of other speakers, even a little bit in the spirit of the examen of consciousness of St. Ignatius. I know we're tired, but just a moment of silence. How am I feeling? Just exhausted, ready to leave, consoled, enriched. At the end of the conference, at the end of this afternoon, just a sense of how am I feeling? Maybe with a special attention to the 3 talks this afternoon. Anything, one enriching thing that spontaneously comes to my mind. One insight received. One spiritual movement experienced. We remember that we have participants online, so they're also welcome to offer comment or a question. So now I invite you for, so I see 2 hands already, one here and so 4 hands, that's in order. Alexi, this man, and then
Sister Maria Choi, the spiritual director for accompany people doing spiritual exercise for the daily lives, okay? So thank you for the wonderful talks these days. To me, I'm more interested in the mystical experience that we received from the divine. God communicates his messages to the one who is doing the spiritual exercise, sometimes just by vision. During the contemplation, it is silent, no words, but the message is so profound. Take one example. Once I accompanied a Christian, not Catholic, to do spiritual exercise. She doesn't believe the flesh and blood in the Eucharist. But during her contemplation, God let her vision the blood and flesh in the Eucharist. So I don't need to explain anything. She experienced. This is, for me, so it's a very wonderful experience from the self-communication from God. However, I found some challenges to me. I mean, the dark light of the soul is the first stage. How to handle the first stage, moving to the second stage. When I was doing 30-day spiritual exercise, a man, a participant, he was living in sin. So his spiritual director did not let him move from the first week to the second week. No, 30 days all the time on the first stage, because even though he go confession, it doesn't help. So to me, sometimes I met some people, if they are living in sin, I don't know how to handle this situation. How can I help the person to move from the first stage to the second stage? And when they experience the dark light of the soul, and how should I help them? I really want to raise this question. Thank you.
A question that could fill a whole seminar, perhaps. And I know that there is a process in Xavier House of the working with spiritual directors, forming spiritual directors. I don't know if any of our commentators, it might be just not exactly on topic from what we were talking about this afternoon. But would anybody, we nevertheless have great expertise here. Anybody like to comment briefly? We have two offers, all right, yes. Matt first and then Patrick.
I think this is a good example of the point that James raised, that there are a number of charisms. And so you mentioned the dark night of the soul, and that's not an Ignatian, that's Carmelite spirituality. And there's a wonderful Carmelite teacher named Constance Fitzgerald in the United States, and she wrote a really seminal essay around 1976 called Dark Night is Impasse. I was thinking to the point before, and then there was a book that came out on, thinking, and this was a book in the United States, and it was really about the US Catholic Church being in an impasse. And so I don't have time to go into the whole point, but, and actually she and a Jesuit expert in Ignatian spirituality, Brian McDermott, used to give talks. So I guess I can't say much more. I can recommend the book to you. But to say that I think this would be a place where another spirituality can complement Ignatian spirituality for thinking about, dark night, and including on a corporate level, which is what this book does.
Yeah, just maybe a few words. I'm a bit reluctant of speaking of steps about the spiritual exercises. It's not, the fact that Ignatius speaks of week is different from steps. So you are not climbing anywhere. You are walking. So I think that you move from one step to another by the desire to move. So the only thing you have to listen to is the desire to move from the person, and not what you think of where the person is. Because if we expect somebody to be without sins because he had confession, we can wait until the end of the time. None of us is non-sinner. And to be in the second week, to be in the third week, to be in the fourth week is always to be a sinner. But with the desire to walk into Jesus' direction, towards him, led by his attractiveness. So, and as Ignatius constantly put it, it is about, even if somebody experiences major obstacle, the only thing we can try to figure out is how is the desire to progress. So that would be my answer, a part of it.
Vast experience here in the exercises, of course, and the whole table. Alexei.
We mentioned a few times Gaston Fessard, and especially on his influence on Pope Francis. One of the aspects that I find very interesting in the work of Gaston Fessard is the attempt to build some categories which are very concrete, to listen to realities and to discern upon them. Especially, I remember of the dialectics of the master and the slave, the man and the woman, the Jews and the pagan, that allowed him to make some very clear discernment on the politics of his time, in a time where many people maybe went wrong. So my question is, do you think this kind of research is still relevant today, and is still relevant in the process of synodality in which we are engaging? Or should we give up this kind of maybe too simplistic way of analyzing reality? Thank you.
Anybody in mind, especially, would you like to direct your question, especially to anybody?
Matthew is good.
Sure.
Okay, Matt, yeah.
I think what Fassard was trying to do, you mentioned, and oh my gosh, I'm going to mention Hegel. Trust me, I won't go very far. But I mean, and he was confronting the interpretation of Hegel by Kojève, which, I mean, basically for Hegel, the master-slave dialectic said that our becoming persons in community is always about conflict, and there's a sort of a zero-sum game. It's sort of like, if I'm going to have you all respect me, I have to get these people to be subject to me. And I think, and this, of course, then led to a certain view of Marxism. And I think the point of Fassard and others is that they saw what that was doing in Europe at the time, that this was not just a philosophy floating up in the sky. It had concrete, ramifications in different forms of totalitarianism. So what he tried to do was to come up with, the different ways of imagining community that go beyond simple conflict, although conflict is a part of it. So, and he saw Ignatian spirituality as a way to do that. Maybe Hegel and Marx are still important forces, but I think it's a matter of reading the signs of the times. For Pope Francis, it was Guardini and the technocratic paradigm. So that kind of work, I think, is very important, and it's philosophical work.
Yeah.
But it's always attending to, in the society, what are the forces that lead to desolation on a kind of a social, communal scale, and what kind of work needs to be done. And some of the work is really contesting these interpretations of our common experience, which is philosophical work. And I think that kind of work is very necessary as long as it keeps grounded in, actually the term historical reality is tricky because Ea Korea used the term. I think the term in French, pardon my French friends for my barbarism with your language, is actualité. Actualité historique, does that sound historical currentness, right? And Fassard was all about that, so yes.
Great, thank you. Just to say, I'm delighted to hear the question of philosophy entering in as well. So we've been hearing about the different dimensions that need to serve synodality going forward: spirituality, theology, and now we've addressed philosophical questions. And we continue to believe, of course, that Ignatian spirituality, and if I can say sort of a Jesuit charism more in general, has something to offer, we hope, going forward in this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I add something? In fact, I had also similar question to Matthew. Yeah, Fassard, he wrote Dialectic of Spiritual Exercises. He was, of course, inspired by Hegel. But Pope Francis, he's not only influenced by Fassard, but also and especially and most importantly by Guardini, by the notion of plurality. It's even more opposing plurality. In fact, why Pope Francis is so influenced by these two persons who talk about almost similar thing, dialectic and plurality, as two opposing force or two opposing, realities. That's because in spiritual exercises, there is this election, which is at the center of the structure of whole spiritual exercises. Election means discernment. So we have to discern between two things. So that's the tension. And Pope Francis, his philosophy is that the Christian spirituality can help us to go beyond plurality and dialectic tensions. So Ignatian spirituality can help us to hold the tensions. We can solve the tension. That's really the words of Pope Francis. He said we can solve the tensions in a higher level, which is election, which is listening to the Holy Spirit. So I don't know if you can.
Thank you. Yes, next gentleman. If you could say to this man next, please. Let's give it. We did say that order, we'd follow that order. And if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. Testing. Okay, I'm Dr. Bernard Lee. I'm from St. Francis University. I got a question for Dr. James Hanvey. Yep. used to be the master of Campion Hall, Oxford University. I was the visiting scholar over there. Thank you so much for your very enriching talk. Yeah, I learned a lot. Yeah, I got a silly question. Yeah, now since I'm working in the university, I just have a very silly question. In what ways can this Ignatian spirituality be integrated into the synodal process within the Catholic University, particularly in Asia? Now, you mentioned there's some practical side, about the practical application. I think, this is something I'm more interested in. Yeah. Can you elaborate a little bit more? Thank you.
Thanks, Bernard. Of course, it's a critical question for all Jesuit apostolates and all Jesuit universities as well. And I would say that the two standards in the exercises is a critical reflection for all institutions, all apostolates. They have to, if you think of the two standards, the kingdom of Christ and the kingdom of the enemy, however that works. And because the question there is about who am I really following? And every institution needs to constantly do that examine. What are the values? What is leading me? Is it profit? Is it prestige? Is it what? Whatever. As opposed to, is it about service? Now, so I think every institution needs to build that sort, if it's interested in real mission, in a faith mission. If it's only about its own building up of its own survival, about building up its endowments, etc., 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 that's a worldly activity, and that's fine. But if it believes that it is an ecclesial institution serving the mission of the church, then it needs to ground itself in the two standards. And that also means then it has to educate its own people for that. And that's a huge work of leadership. And I'm not sure that has been successful in our institutions, in our Jesuit institutions, let alone the Franciscan. But the great advantage that institutions like your own have is we all draw upon that spirituality of our founding charism. So how does the Franciscan play out in that? How does the Ignatian thing play out? But it comes down to which kingdom are you serving? And that, I think, is a tough question for us all.
Matt, many years in a university administrator, has something to say.
Actually, since Martin Meyer isn't here, I want to say something about Ignacio Ellacuría, because he was a university president, and he gave a series of 8 lectures on the spiritual exercises. 2 of them, so think, the two standards is a tiny fraction in terms of, I think it's like, 6 paragraphs out of 200. 2 of Ellacuría's lectures on the spiritual exercises were focused on the 2 standards, and he wrote essays on what he was trying to do at the University of Central America, the UCA, and he asked the question, is a different kind of university possible? And he raised exactly that question. He said, we in a university have to decide which standard we were following. So I think Ellacuría, in his thinking about how to shape the university, he was absolutely on board with that.
On the same level, I think that one of the major turn we are living at the moment, which started in fact with Benedict XVI, and not only with Francis, is to acknowledge that the Church itself has to do this examine. Which standard the Church is following? There was the assumption that because the Church is the Church, that we were following Jesus Christ. But we had discovered, and thanks to Benedict XVI, through the sexual abuse in the church, remember the Friday night, the Holy Friday, the Good Friday homily, how it was important to say the church is a sinner. That's absolutely central to what we are talking about. If we don't do that, we become an ideology. And that's the major threat for the Catholic Church.
Thank you very much. Ramon.
Hi, well, thank you to everyone, the speakers. I have a question probably to synodality and synodal processes. In the exercises, discernment is done in order to an election. And sometimes I'm missing the word decision-making in the discernment process. If we cannot reach this election, these decisions, I have a question to the discernment process, because everyone who has done a discernment, even I know it from myself, I can have the risk to stay for a very long time in discernment in order not to make a decision, in order to delay the decision. And this is also a risk for the church, I think. I'm thinking especially in the Synod of the Amazonia. I thought it was the time to do something and not stay in discernment in order to female deacons, in order to viri probati, and we delay the decision. And we are playing with the disappointment of people who were asked what they think, but the decisions didn't come. I think this is a risk for the discernment.
Thank you. Anybody want to comment? Maybe, if I may just make a comment. I read in my talk a quotation from the final document of the Synod, which touched really just this point. The ecclesial discernment, the key of what they say the document is about. It's not only ecclesial discernment, it's decision-making processes, the diverse charisms in the church that contribute to a decision-making process, and processes of accountability and transparency. So there's an echo of sexual abuse matters even there, who's doing the deciding and what accountability. So at least you might say as a pious intention, the final document states that. Maybe if I may say another point, the synthesis document of 2023 clarified, this has already been mentioned, but how many important issues there are, but relatively speaking, I interpret a bit too much how little consensus there was on most of those issues. So we're perhaps at this stage in the Synod up against a situation where there is not consensus on a lot of matters. So can you make decisions before there is consensus, I think is the implication. So maybe it's a major cultural change that's going to take a long time to see the decisions that come out from the synodal process, would be my thought. But if anybody else would like to comment.
Thanks very much, Herman. I think this is one of the critical issues in which we're all going to have to grow. Because, you see, I think the two standards and discernment go together, the ordinary, what I would call the ordinary business of the first and second week discernments. But the two standards are clear. There are two types of discernment, I would think. One is around principles that you cannot negotiate on, that you have to stand up for. Like, Patrick's just spoken about abuse. We can't say, oh, well, we'll delay that statement because, it's embarrassing. No, there's a matter of profound truthfulness and principle there, in which the whole integrity of the church depends. There will be other issues like that. But around the other things that are coming up, I think one of the things that Francis has shown is his own freedom about saying, we're not ready to reach a decision on that. As you were saying, to discern, not to discern, or not to put discernment off, but to engage in the process until we're ready, until we have arrived. And you see that even in the early church. I forget which part of Paul's letter. Remember what Paul says, is it Corinthians, where Paul says, look, take very good care that your liberality may cause others to stumble. So again, it's about taking responsibility for the whole church, each one of us. I have a brilliant insight, a wonderful agenda. This must be done tomorrow, but it's not going to help you. So we're all in this process, painful, confusing, but I think it's about us maturing in our own sense of being Catholic and being the Church.
And one thing which I always found very helpful is to remember that Ignatius, in his diary, stumbled himself on discernment. He was trapped. So even the founder of the spiritual exercises had to still learn during his whole life how to discern. And that's wonderful. So we are all learners, and we are all learning. I think the other thing, and I think Matthew, you mentioned it very clearly, and James also. I think we'd better understand the difference between, and how it is articulate, deliberatio and discernment. And there is a deliberatio on ideas and discernment on making decision. The thing is, we are making decision on ideas. So it makes it a bit more complicated.
Thank you. Now we have 5 minutes, so maybe 2 questions together, and then we'll see what we can do. So there's a hand up there. So two hands up. The gentleman at the back, and then Chiara. The gentleman gives priority to
Thank you. I have a question for Father Martin online, because your article mentioned the salvation of Christians.
Sorry, Father Martin is not online, I'm afraid. Martin Meyer, is that?
Martin Meyer, yeah.
But he's not present, I'm afraid. Okay, raise your question, but in his absence.
Okay. Because his article mentioned the practice of Christian salvation and the liberation theology. So my question is that how do you distinguish the practice of Christian salvation and modern liberation theology? Because I think to confuse these two may risk to misguide people to plagiarism. And because the doctrine of Christian salvation is based on the grace of God and the sacrifice of Christ on the cross to liberate humans from sinful nature and the consequence of their sins. However, the underlying principle of modern liberation theology is more about humanism, individualism, and subjectivism. Its practice normally relates to Marxist social justice, political revolution, democracy, social service, gender equality, etc. So I was wondering how he distinguishes the practice of Christian salvation and the liberation theology.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's let's take the second question and then see what we can do before we finish. Do you want to ask your question briefly? The man in the center there.
I have a question for a speaker from overseas. I'm glad that this symposium is held in Hong Kong. It is which is a special administrative region in mainland China. When we are talking about church reform, we can't get rid of this context, especially between the collaboration between Hong Kong and mainland China. And because I am just a lay person, but frequently visit mainland China and do some spiritual work for them. Therefore, I just want to see if you have any advice or comment from the perspective of Ignatius spirituality on church reform.
Okay. Church reform related to collaboration, Hong Kong and mainland China. So 2 questions, not easy questions. We'll leave any volunteers to, good man, Matt is ready to.
And I'll just use the way that Martin did it. Sure, you shouldn't confuse them any more than we should confuse the divine nature of Christ and the human nature of Christ, but we shouldn't separate them either. that there's, and I think we could say that the incarnation is not just an event that happened once. I mean, Jesus took flesh, but we all become human beings over time. The incarnation is a process. And it's, so I think Martin's point with Eikaria was to say that if we totally separate them, we're not following the logic of the incarnation the way that Chalcedon put it out. But sure, we shouldn't confuse them either. Now, how Eikaria does that is through this very sort of dense philosophy, which I will not take us through, but and there are many. The problem with using the category of liberation theology is there are many liberation theologies, and sure, I think some of them run the risk of confusion, but I think the central insight is that we have to have both, and in our action, both as individuals and people, we have to integrate that. And the way that Eikaria would say that is, what it means to be a follower of Christ is to make real in our political situation that Christological reality, that we at the same time are attentive to the transcendent dimension and also the material, because that's what the incarnation is about. And so for Eikaria, the following Christ means to continue what Christ did in his own time. So yes, don't confuse them, but also don't separate them, because both of those would be against the reality of Christ and whom we are called to follow.
Thank you.
The speakers, please come out, take a photo.
Good.